Okay, this is yet another exciting book review on an older book on covering the Iran-Contra scandal. This is called Out of Control by uh, Leslie Cockburn, if I think I'm pronouncing that correctly. But this is one of the better books that I found on the subject of the Iran-Contra scandal. If you're fascinated about that and you've heard of the whole October surprise in the 1980 election, this is a really, to use the parlance of our times, this is a deep dive into that subject. And as you can see, I've, in typical, fashion here, I've dog-eared a lot of pages in this. There's a lot of stuff now that if you get this, you will definitely want you every few pages. If you're like me and you get into this kind of organized criminal activity and government corruption, you will find yourself Googling stuff in this about every other page. Or actually, and I've found lately, I say Google, I've found a lot of other search engines are better suited for digging up corruption like what you'll find in here. So, and on that note, any of you watching that are into this sort of research, I'd love to hear your comments on good search engines to look up this. I've been using DuckDuckGo and some similar ones, but I found Google to be very difficult to actually find good information when you start digging into topics like this. But anyway, Out of Control by Leslie Cockburn. I believe this was published in the late 80s. Let me check, because obviously it came out after Oliver North's testimony. 1987, so this was fresh, written right as this stuff was happening. And the interesting thing about this is this really gets into a lot of the CIA involvement with drug dealing and a lot of the drug trafficking that was happening to help aid the Contras. And if you're unfamiliar with that story, a quick overview of it. The way it worked out was in order to fund covert operations outside of the view of Congress, the Contras were moving cocaine into the United States and selling it within the United States, and that the profits from the cocaine sales were being used to arm the Contras. And this allowed for a whole system of money system and fundraising system to work outside of the control of Congress. And that's probably one of the more eye-opening things to me reading this was I think a lot of times those of us that get into investigating government corruption like this, it's easy to think that the whole system is corrupt top to bottom. And when you read this, and there's some other books that hopefully I'll get around to reviewing later on, you see that there is corruption, but the corruption is in key positions. There's certain places where the corruption, and this would be a great place to put up some kind of flow chart and some map, but I'm not that graphic savvy. But I think there's key points where the corruption exists, but the corruption is not as widespread as I think some of the conspiracy authors would like people to think. I think there are very corrupt people throughout the system, but the whole system is not as corrupt as is sometimes thought. So this is a fascinating look at that. And one of the things I really found of interest with this is this precedes Gary Webb's work by almost a decade. And those of you, again, in the know, so to speak, will know Gary Webb's Dark Alliance series that ran in the San Jose Mercury newspaper out in California. I think that ran in 1996, where he uncovered a lot of the crack epidemic traced back to the CIA and drug dealers who had the blessing of the CIA to bring in the drugs and then sell it in the inner city. And I know I'm giving that, that's a very, very much a very Cliff Notes kind of view of that situation. But the Cockburns wrote about this 10 years prior, and a lot of what she writes about in this is I was really surprised at how much was known about that and about some of these covert operations almost right as they were unfolding. Because obviously if this book came out in 87, that means she was writing it probably throughout 1987, if not 86 and 85. But really interesting information in this, and too much to really catalog in a review. But suffice to say, if you're into this sort of thing, I highly recommend this because lots of good information. I'm trying to remember how the index, if the index is it has a somewhat limited, I don't know if it had a subject index or not, but it's not as good as some of the others I've read, but still very valuable text. And as you can see from how many times I've dog-eared it here, very valuable information. And this is one of those books that it's good to have around, especially looking back at this information some 35 years later, at how much they were spot on some of the corruption issues looking into this. So again, Out of Control by Leslie Cockburn, great book. And I think I keep saying they, I think she and her husband were both investigative reporters. And I think they also turned up some information on some things relative to Dulce, New Mexico. And I say that I can't prove it. I think it was in a British publication. I've been trying to run it down, but I found their names attached to an article that references a chemical weapon project that they say was run out of New Mexico and out of an Indian reservation. I think they referred to as Yellow Lodge or D6 or something like that. So I'll follow up more later on that, or if any of you have better search resources than I do, I'd love to see if any of you have stumbled into that, because there's some very cryptic stuff about Dulce, New Mexico, and the involvement of Indian reservations in working on secret weapons programs because of their status as a sovereign nation and being able to operate somewhat outside of the law, like the Cabazon tribe was knee deep in some of that in the early 80s. So anyway, Out of Control by Leslie Cockburn, great book, highly recommend it, especially if you're digging into any kind of covert operations and you want to see how some of that stuff works. This book really gets into it.